Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Financial Planning in Uncertain Times, New Strategies for Hospitals and Health Systems. I am Ayla Ellison with Becker's Hospital Review. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your screen. We are looking forward to hearing your questions. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access the recording. At this time, it is now my pleasure to start today's webinar by introducing our presenter. Frank Stevens is VP of Solution Engineering and Planning for Strata Decision Technology. Frank joined Strata in early 2004 and has since deployed planning solutions and process improvements at over 150 organizations. Frank is an industry thought leader in new cutting-edge approaches related to financial planning and performance management, helping organizations to transition to more efficient and agile approaches. Frank led the advanced planning practice work with the leading organizations in healthcare, including Advocate Aurora Health, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, the Cleveland Clinic, and many more. At this time, I am pleased to turn the floor over to Frank to begin today's presentation.
All right. Well, thank you, Ayla. Very much appreciate that and appreciate everyone's time today, carving out the next hour to go through how healthcare systems are rethinking their planning processes, their approaches to planning in the COVID era. As just a matter of logistics, again, please post any questions that you all have during the session in the Q&A box. There will be some time at the end to answer those. For the agenda today, I'm going to go through really three different things. Talk about why organizations are reconsidering their approach to planning, their budget, rolling forecasting, and long-range planning processes. We'll talk about the shifts that we see organizations making. As Ayla mentioned, I've worked with about 150 health systems on their planning processes. Strata Decision works with about 220 health systems in total. I've been doing this I myself for the last 16 years, spending really a lot of time not only on the tools, but also on the process side of these approaches. And probably in the last 2-3 months, seeing more of a shift, more velocity momentum towards more advanced approaches to planning than ever before. After we talk about the planning side, we're going to shift and talk a little bit about, well, then what comes next? All that planning really is for naught if we're not holding folks accountable to that plan. And so how are organizations looking at their performance management process and maybe making some improvements and changes there as well. And then we'll wrap up just with a few thoughts about how you can maybe apply some of the lessons that I share, we talk about today at your organizations, and there'll be some time just to address some of the questions that come through. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Again, please use the Q&A box for any questions that you have, but also if you have any questions following this session, feel free to email me at fstevens@stratadecision.com. So we'll dive in. So to talk a little bit about what we've seen over the last 3.5 months, many organizations have found that traditional budget approaches that probably weren't cutting it before COVID are definitely not cutting it right now. When we talk about really good planning processes, tend to group that into really 4 different buckets, or 4 different attributes, if you will. Organizations that are finding efficiencies as it relates to their planning processes. So if you look at the average health system, they probably spend 5 to 6 months budgeting. Tens of thousands of hours go into the development of that budget. The shift to more advanced or better approaches often entails finding efficiencies and automation to reduce that, to half the time. In some cases, we'll talk about organizations that have cut down the planning process, at least for a planning cycle, to weeks. Obviously, accuracy is important. Many of us, I know on the phone today, come from accounting backgrounds where detail is king. Detail often gets associated with accuracy. One of the things that we see the cutting edge organizations doing is understanding where detail matters and where it doesn't, and basing their efforts on that materiality. And kind of thirdly, agility. If ever there was a time to be agile, and if there's one thing that you get across today from this session, it's about how you can increase the agility within your planning process. Typically or traditionally, that conversation centers around things like rolling forecasts or even beyond budgeting principles. We're going to talk about what we've seen be really effective and what we've seen not be effective at organizations as they look to make that shift from an annual budget process to maybe a rolling forecast. And then lastly, taking that plan and then using that to drive accountability, drive performance, et cetera. Any organization that is, serious, looking at making improvements to their planning process can't really exclude the what happens next side of this in terms of what we're putting in front of managers, VPs, executive leaders on a daily, biweekly, and monthly basis. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today as well, too. All right. So just to talk a little bit about the baseline, what were most organizations doing prior to 2020? Well, I think it really boils down into a 4 or 5 step process. It probably looks a little bit different at each organization, at each health system. As I think about it, what those processes often look like, it starts with evaluating the baseline, looking at profitability on a service line, physician, business type, entity basis, understanding where we are, understanding where we've had past financial challenges. And that really then takes us into then the second step in that process, wanting to define targets. So who do we want to be? What do we want to be as an organization? Do we want to achieve a AA Moody's rating? Maybe there's a certain days cash on hand, maybe all of the above. We lay out those targets and set those targets for our organization into the future, and then we often find that there's a gap. So where we are today versus where we want to be, there's a gap. And a big part, maybe the most effort-intensive part, if not one of the top areas of effort spent, is then solving for that gap. And we look at things like, well, strategic pricing. What do our contracts look like? Are there options to negotiate more favorable terms with our payers? Looking at efficiencies or cost savings due to quality, variation, staffing practices, et cetera. Looking if there's opportunities to grow the business via different capital investments or business plans. And it's a combination of all those different things that then come together to then solve for that gap. It's, rarely, if ever, one thing, it's often multiple things. And if anything, our customers have been telling us, our clients have been telling us that lately it's a lot of little things as opposed to 1 or 2 big things. The next step within that is, well, now we've solved for that gap. We have a plan, but there's the key step of operationalizing that plan. Aligning everyone from our department managers up to an executive level around how we're going to achieve that plan and preparing to hold folks accountable to that. And then lastly, it is the performance monitoring, management, how we go ahead and look at how we're tracking to that plan, and then on an ongoing basis, adjust. And I think that's one of the areas where organizations have typically found it to be challenging to adjust in the face of adversity or differences. When we interview the industry on their planning processes today, one of the questions we often ask is, when do you find the budget, your operating budget, to be out of date? And even organizations that have great flex budgeting approaches will tell us that the budget's out of date within the first quarter or first month or as soon as it's completed, because enough changes. The industry itself is dynamic enough that by the time we're done developing that budget's already out of date. So with that, and then in the face of COVID, I think organizations more than ever are looking at and accepting of alternative approaches. And so what was once maybe an annual cycle, really the new kind of cutting edge or advancements that organizations are looking to get to is rapid cycles. In those 5 steps that we just walked through, how do you do that not once a year? How do you do that every quarter, or in some cases every month, or in some cases on an ad hoc basis as things change? And that's largely what we're going to be talking about today. As we talk about that, I'm going to introduce a few different terms. One of those terms that Stratus coined is dynamic planning. And really what that is a combination of 2 things. Yes, it's a matter of maybe shifting from traditional department budgets to higher level rolling forecasts, and we're going to talk about that. For some organizations, that looks like a rolling forecast being conducted on a quarterly basis, perhaps looking at the rest of the current fiscal year and the next year. Other organizations may look at longer or shorter time periods. Other organizations may have a more regular or less regular cadence, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But they're constantly going back and assessing where they are versus where they want it to be and solving for that gap, not once a year, but all the time. Hand in hand with that, or maybe the most important part about that, is then what you do from a performance management standpoint. As it's been said, I've had a lot of experience in implementing these tools and these types of processes at organizations. And I think what gets undersold is the performance management side. Largely, the forecasting side is the easier part. But what do you do now, when you have a rolling forecast, for example? How do you hold folks accountable? Do those targets change? What do we present to the board? Do the rolling forecast and performance targets need to be completely aligned or not? Those are some of the questions we're going to explore today too, and I can share some examples of what we found to be effective at organizations. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the planning side, that first half, and then we'll get to the performance management side. And I think the easiest way to talk about what this term that we introduced, dynamic planning, is really about is to do the side-by-side with the traditional budget process. So in a traditional budget process, folks on the webinar today know this, it's a lot about the detail. It's incredibly intensive in terms of the time that goes into it. For that reason, most organizations only budget once a year. It's called the annual budget process. Traditionally, the level of detail that's looked at, it's by cost center, by department, down to a GL account or sub-account level, looking at labor across job codes and different categories of pay. And at the end of that, we use that budget, obviously, to hold our managers and leadership accountable to a plan. We may flex or volume adjust that plan throughout the year. So if volumes are lower or higher, well, then let's go ahead and correspondingly adjust those targets. But it's a once-a-year cycle, and that plan, as we said before, is largely out of date. At least many folks tell us they find it out of date pretty shortly after it's completed. With dynamic planning, it's a shift in focus. It's moving away from granularity, at least where granularity may not matter. So focusing the detailed analysis on the key things that drive business. So your key business drivers, what often is the reason that organizations don't hit their targets? It's because of volumes, it's because of payer mix, it's the big things. And so let's focus on a plan there. Let's analyze different scenarios, what ifs, if you will, on those key high-level drivers, and focus our time and attention on that versus managing minutia and many things that won't change or won't be material at the completion of that plan. When organizations take this approach, we often get the question, what frequency for organizations that have shifted to a rolling forecast approach, do most organizations update that plan? Well, Strato, about 30 to 40% of our clients have or are in the process of shifting to this type of approach. Most of them start with a quarterly process. So they start there. Some have moved to monthly cadences as they found efficiencies, gain additional knowledge on how to run this type of process. Some organizations that we work with that have been doing this for some time say they have more of an event-driven approach, so a little bit more nimble. Rather than updating monthly or quarterly, it might be as circumstances change that they update that rolling forecast. And like I said before, the duration or kind of the time horizon that most look at within this plan is usually this year and the next year, and using that to then inform a long-range financial plan, and using the long-range financial plan to set targets for the exercises that we're discussing today. In making that shift to something that's more nimble, they are often looking at a higher level of resolution, or I should say it the other way. I think that would mean more detailed. They're often keeping things a little bit higher level in the way that they plan. So maybe not down to department and account, but maybe more by entity or patient types, or entity and patient type. Not necessarily focusing on individual GL accounts or sub-accounts, but instead looking at what I like to say, one level of resolution beneath the financial statement level. So if, we're looking at supplies, it's probably medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, and other supplies broken out into 3 different buckets. What's interesting about this is that almost all the organizations that we've worked with on this approach have told us it really doesn't change how they present the plan to their board. Once a year, they take this rolling forecast process, and usually it's the last quarter's rolling forecast of a fiscal year where they're looking at the remaining 3 months of the current year and all of the next year, that they're then using that next year rolling forecast as a planning exercise and presenting the target, the plan to the board, and that's their annual target for the year. One thing just to be clear about this is that almost all organizations that have found success with this approach, they're not adjusting the overall target for the year 4 times or on a monthly basis. They largely set those targets for the year, but then they use the rolling forecast throughout the year to manage to that target, identify where they have the gaps, and make adjustments in the plan as they go. Number one question that comes up when an organization's interested in taking this approach is, well, that sounds great. Higher level, simpler, more agile, all of that's great. But if we're not looking at detailed department account level, what do we hold our department managers and, for that matter, our VPs responsible to? And what we found to be most effective there is shifting the approach. A lot of variance reporting, budget variance reporting. It's a P&L that we send out with account drill downs, and we're comparing actual versus budget versus flex budget versus prior year. When organizations take this approach, what we often recommend is shifting that to more a scorecard, one comprised of maybe 5 to 7 key metrics. We're going to take the example of a nursing floor. Think units of service, charges per unit of service, labor per unit of service, supplies per unit of service, and all other controllable expenses on a per unit service basis. We'll talk about fixed departments because those are going to be different in a little bit. And we start then taking those metrics and using prior performance to inform a target. So it's not just prior performance, because we might not like how we performed priorly. But if we go ahead and look at the last month, last 3 months, last 6 months, last 12 months, the same month of the prior year, what if we hold managers accountable to maintaining or improving those 5 to 7 key metrics? We do that 12 times a year. We're going to hit our financial targets, and we're going to be a better organization at the end of it. And on top of that, there are going to be material things that you can't just use prior performance for. So perhaps incorporating some of the material initiatives and what we call efficiency factors on top of that past performance to ensure that the rolling forecast that's been developed and these targets that are making their way down to the operational level are aligned. If you think about that visually, this is maybe what that process looks like. So think about the different swim lanes here going horizontally across the diagram. You have your long-range planning process, the short-range or rolling forecast process that we're describing, and then everything that you're doing on performance management. In an organization, let's say with a December year-end, like the organization you see here, at the start of each quarter, they may be updating that rolling forecast. Again, looking at how the rest of this year is going to end up, what next year looks like, maybe looking at a longer or shorter period. It just depends based on the organization. With that, you also have to think about that the budget process didn't really just satisfy one purpose, it fulfilled multiple purposes. So a budget, it's a forecast, it's used to set targets, it's where we make a lot of our resource allocation discussions, and we use it throughout the year to manage performance. So when we change anything with a budget process, whether it's adopting a rolling forecast or not, you have to make sure that all of those different functions that it satisfied are met or improved upon. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but for many organizations, that shift happens in the way that we look at resources. Do we have a monthly position approval committee that's deciding whether we fill or don't fill these positions based on everything we know right now? From a target setting standpoint, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but the long-range plan is really important to consider how that relates to the rolling forecast. So in certain points of the year, we might be using that long-range plan to set targets for next year's plan. When we're done updating the rolling forecast, we want that to feed back into the long-range plan and reproject then years 2, 3, 4, and 5, for example. So it's described often as kind of a snake eating its tail. The long-range plan setting the targets, but at the end of this, we need to feed that rolling forecast back into the long-range plan and rebase it off of everything that we know now. I mentioned this before, but it's a common question. So if you're taking this type of approach, do you still present an annual target to the board? We find in almost all cases, yes. And usually it's that last rolling forecast of the fiscal year. So the forecast iteration that we might be working on in October at a December year-end organization, well, we're presenting that sometime in November before Thanksgiving to our board. That sets the target for the year. And then when we come into Q1 of 2021, we're still comparing back to that target. And now we're thinking about knowing what we now know. Volumes are down, volumes are up. There's been a second wave of COVID, et cetera. We're adjusting that plan in a more agile type of fashion. It's a little bit different right now, but largely this is then how those other iterations of a rolling forecast, what they're really intended to do. So if you're looking at the example that's in front of you right here, think about the blue dashed line as being our cumulative margin target for the year, and the dark blue line corresponding to what we've actually seen happen. And maybe this is similar to what you've seen at your organization so far for this year, where first 2 months kind of on track with plan, everything kind of went awry coming in March, and maybe now we're starting to see some recovery in our May and June financial data. Well, if we're looking at this and comparing to our original targets, we might need to go ahead and reassess, is the original target achievable? Probably not for most organizations. Others may kind of use that rolling forecast to reproject a new target for fiscal year 2020 or fiscal year 2021. But largely what we're doing is just, again, looking at the target versus where we would organically end up and understanding what that gap is. As it relates to COVID recovery, just probably an equation that all of you have looked at in something like this or maybe slightly different formats, but this is what we see organizations doing right now. Looking at what financial performance or financial position needs to look like by the end of the year. That might be a cash balance to weather another COVID storm or otherwise, but starting there with where we want to end up, and then taking the difference between that and where we are today. So two are kind of our current cash or current financial position, layering in the impact of any CARES Act funding that we may have received, and making sure that we spend that on COVID-related items before the end of the year. Looking at any internal programs that we may have impacting cash flow for the rest of the year, and through that, taking the difference between the two of those, understanding then what that required recovery target looks like. And we may have enough initiatives, items to address the gap in the kitty today, we might not, but continuing to compare then what that required target is versus what we are setting ourselves up to do and finding the differences, and then continuing to solve for hopefully smaller and smaller gaps. When we talk about the rolling forecast, because it is at a higher level, there's a little bit different ownership structure than maybe a traditional budget process. If we were going to stack up some of the medium to large health systems that we've seen be effective with this process, what that structure looks like is largely represented here. What I'll say, we've seen many small organizations be very successful with the rolling forecast process too, but largely the ownership is kind of within a single finance team. So what I mean by that is at a large health system, there is a delineation in role between the corporate and the finance team, and then the entity or regional finance teams. So corporate finance may be responsible for populating some of the macro and high-level assumptions within that rolling forecast or financial plan. Certain items related to merit increases, for example, may be controlled at the system level or not. If they are, largely the responsibility of the corporate finance team. If not, then the local finance teams. Whatever that breakdown looks like, and it's going to be different from organization to organization, the key is that there's clear communication as to who owns what, and that it's a sequential process as to not step on each other's toes. So I work with one organization, about a 45 hospital health system. They've actually moved to a monthly rolling forecast process, and they've built it into their close process, in fact. So what they do is they close financials on the 10th or 11th business day of the month, and then within 2 to 3 days following that, just depending if it's a quarterly or monthly update, they're complete with an iteration or update to the rolling forecast. The first day, the corporate finance team pushes out all the key health system assumptions to each of their regions. On days 2 and 3, the regions update their forecasts based on the localized and nuanced knowledge that they have. So there are ways that over time to take this process, get more and more efficient with it, and it's not going to be, month-long process to update the plan. Although you might start there just to set the expectation, but over time get that down to weeks or a week or even days. We're going to go to performance management next, so I'm going to cover that in just a little bit. Last couple things I'll mention on planning. At least here right now, fiscal year end is very material, kind of important, whether you're considering maybe shifting to a rolling forecast process indefinitely or just for the foreseeable future due to COVID, for example. Where you are in your fiscal year probably dictates what you do and how you do it. So what I mean by that is work with some junior end organizations. Obviously, we're at June, end of June here today. And so they've largely probably put together a plan, though they probably feel that that plan is already out of date. We were talking to an organization in the Southeast. They told us they came March, they said, we really can't work on a budget anymore. Everyday environment, circumstances are changing enough that the work we are doing is largely need to be thrown away. Pencils up on the budget process. Let's shift to a rolling forecast. Other organizations that are December year ends are probably just right now beginning to start on their planning process, next year's budget, preparing for that. And so one of the things that we like to think about is that there are different ways of approaching this. Maybe it's a belt and suspenders. Maybe you want to, because of the change management and organizational momentum that you already have, still do a detailed budget, but complement that with a high-level rolling forecast. Or maybe you want to use a high-level rolling forecast to continue projections for the rest of the year, but when it comes to setting the targets for 2021, we're going to do a detailed budget. Or we just want to use high-level rolling forecast now. All of those are viable options, and we've seen organizations in the past be successful with all those different approaches. We're continuing to see that right now. At the very least, I think there's never been more momentum for organizations at least complementing an annual budget process with the rolling forecast. So even if they're not replacing the annual budget process, having that rolling forecast in place to continue reprojecting, looking at the year as things change and incorporating that. Then now flip in and talk to the performance management piece. So what happens after that plan is created? How does that work in a rolling forecast type of approach? I think there is more than just kind of what we're doing with the target or even a tool set basis. There is a mindset change that needs to occur when taking this type of approach. What we hear more often than not is that budgets maybe incentivize some unfavorable types of behaviors at many organizations in the past. It was looked at as, this is my piece of the pie, or this is my allocated funds, my bank account, and I can spend all of it. When shifting away from a traditional budget or even a flex budget, we kind of group both of those together, the dialogue changes often from saying, is this in the budget, and therefore I can spend it, versus do I need this right now? And that is a heavy lift. Believe me, in making this type of transition happen at 20 plus organizations, at least within my experience, this is the hardest part of making that transition, that cultural mindset change that needs to occur to get folks thinking differently. I'll tell you that even organizations that make this type of change, what they'll tell us is 2 or 3 years after we took out a traditional budget process and shifted to rolling forecast, we still hear our managers say, is that in my budget? Now, over time, I think we've learned what makes sense and how to make this work from a change management perspective. So hopefully we see organizations experiencing that less and less. But that being said, I think it's important to be very realistic that this is a big change from the cultural, from the mindset standpoint. largely covered this already, but just a few points to pull forward here. So whereas budgets may have been used as spending limits, or at least that's how they were viewed by department managers, in this type of approach, it's really about managing your KPIs. Again, it's not that this is the amount of total dollars I have to spend. It's that this is my controllable expense per unit of service, and am I improving on that or not? When making this type of shift, it's less about thinking just about kind of high-level initiatives that need to be incorporated, but also localized department-level initiatives. Either way, though, materiality is key. So what we'll tell organizations is that when you're looking to adjust performance targets in this type of approach, focus on or set a definition of what's material, and only adjust those targets for those things that are material. Variances aren't always bad. So the goal here isn't to adjust targets to the point where you have no variances. It's to understand why you have variances and what are being done about it. And that largely speaks to the type of workflow that organizations necessitate when kind of making this shift. So it's all about making it easy to do the right things, as you might say. And when it comes to looking at monthly performance, where traditionally in the past that might have been an actual to budget or actual to flex budget comparison, and now we're talking about shifting to KPIs in the scorecard. The workflow here, I think, represents what needs to happen at least every month. So we need our department managers to understand, is there an issue? Is it clear that they are not hitting one of their 5 or 7 KPIs? Making it easy for them to understand why they're not hitting that target. Or if they are beating the target, understanding that too. That's a very important point to pull across as well, is that when we have favorable performance, what's driving that and how do we maintain that? But when we do have then an unfavorable variance, making it necessary then to document and capture a plan. How are we going to address this? I was on the phone with an organization in the Southeast prior to this conversation, and they were saying that they have a very low hit rate, as they refer to it, on the reports that they're pushing out to their department managers and VPs today. Those variance reports don't often get reviewed. One of the things that we find when you start surrounding the variance or performance reporting process with the need to document action plans, that hit rate goes up. So folks start reviewing the reports. They know that when they document an action plan, when they have a material variance, others are going to be reviewing that, looking at that. And so that drives accountability. That drives greater, I think, responsibility taken by then department managers. And so then in this sequence, then once the manager understands what's wrong, they've documented that plan, then how do we aggregate that to our leaders from an operational and finance perspective to summarize for them what the material issues were, what are the plans being addressed, and then making it easy to track progress against those plans. Broken down another way, there's really kind of 3 ingredients to the recipe here. So it's about putting forth actionable metrics, meaning things that folks can action, that they actually control. We've had some organizations tell us, I'm not going to put certain expenses that are kind of uncontrollable in front of our department managers anymore because it confuses the discussion. This is something that they largely can't impact in a favorable or unfavorable way. So why put that metric in front of them? That can be debated if it's helpful just to have that context or not, but focusing the discussion on the actionable metrics, obviously important. The folks that we're asking to review the financial performance largely aren't coming from financial backgrounds. So it's kind of funny that we put a financial statement type of format in front of them. What we found to be more effective is meeting them in something that's more contextual for them, with more of a scorecard or KPI dashboard, something a little bit easier to follow. And then key to this is having a really well communicated and documented process. So a consistent process that's understood by the organization and that's been largely communicated. When we talk about these scorecards, just to give you an idea of what that might look like, it's largely, again, 5 to 7 key metrics that a manager can control. What we see to be trends with, and I know there's been some questions regarding flex budgeting. This is largely the building blocks of a flex budget, but we're shifting the viewpoint to more of the supply per unit service, the controllable expense, or labor per unit of service, and that's our metric, because that's what's so important for the department manager or operational leader to understand is, what's our run rate? Is that getting better or worse? This is what you can control. And focused on those per unit of service metrics is key to driving success with this type of approach. Like we said, the targets that we're using here are often based on some type of rolling months average or maybe same month of the prior year, and then applying some adjustments and efficiency factors. So an example of that, if in our June forecast, our rolling forecast, we said we're really trying to control agency and overtime for the rest of the year and going forward, then maybe we would take prior performance targets and push out what we'd call an efficiency factor. We're going to reduce overtime and agency by 10% for the remaining months of this year. So it's not always just perpetuating the sins of the past or prior performance issues. It's about adjusting them when material. You don't want to get back in the process of adjusting these targets every month and getting into the detail that you were doing with a traditional annual budget, because it won't be sustainable. So you have to set rules for yourself regarding what's material and what's not, and then also setting rules for when action plans are required or not. So what's that materiality threshold? At what variance do we require a department manager to document the action plan? Might be 5%, or it might be $5,000 variance, or a combination. It really is going to depend based on your organization, maybe the area within the organization, the materiality size of that particular entity in terms of what qualifies as a material or not variance. What does that look like in terms of the monthly process that needs to be run here? So let's say this organization, they're closing here on the 10th of the month. For the next 3 days following that, they're then capturing the commentary from their department managers, where they had material variances, what was driving it, what are the action plans. And really, you need no more than 3 days to do that, we found at most organizations. In the past, I would have said, 5 days, give them enough time to do this. Actually, we found organizations be more successful with a shorter window. It drives more compliance to this type of process. From there, then, we roll up the commentary or automate that roll up and send out flash reports to leadership showing them, here were the material variances under your area for the month, and here's what's being done about it. And then maybe on a quarterly basis, kind of step 4 here, we get together as a functional area. So think VP of nursing in the room with all of his or her reports and going through the last quarter, talking about the upcoming quarter. And we've seen organizations really drive a lot of success with that type of formal business review happening on a quarterly or monthly basis. Some organizations even have the rolling forecast pulled up when those discussions are going on so that they can be making adjustments based on the things that they're hearing, the localized knowledge that's coming out of those discussions. If you think about it from a hierarchical standpoint, so on a monthly basis, reviewing the department variances. What I will say too is that biweekly and daily productivity are very much a part of this equation as well. So there are things that our managers are going to be looking at on a daily and biweekly basis in this approach. We're largely talking about, though, what happens on this formal monthly review process. Monthly or quarterly, then, a functional area review occurs in a formal basis, but regardless, every month, the key variances, the action plans are being submitted and summarized for our leadership so everyone's aware, and then we're feeding that right back into the insight, that is, to the rolling forecast process. Like we talked about before, based on your fiscal year, there might be differences in approach, and that probably holds true for the performance management side as well. Organizations that had a pretty stale budget come March and April saw that a budget target, even a flex budget target, wasn't going to work in the face of COVID. And so perhaps using something like just looking at the prior month. What did the KPIs look like from April as we headed into May? Did we improve or did it get worse? Kind of that eye chart type of approach, or even looking back to, a rolling period of time and shifting the dialogue to more of this continuous improvement focus versus an annual budget culture. Just the last few things to wrap up here before we take a couple of questions at the end. It's helpful to think about at what levels are we presenting targets to and what gets presented, largely at an entity and system level. That forecast that got approved, that is the target for the year. At lower levels, operational levels, it's this ongoing improvement type of target that's being used. Redefining what variance really means at an organization. Yes, unfavorable variances are bad, but not all variances are a symptom of poor management. And so organizations that adopt this approach, being very clear with department managers and operations that, having to submit an action plan, or within the business review process, having to present a challenge, that is not being sent to the principal's office. That's just what good business management looks like. And so when we are off from target, it's really about what we do versus the fact that we were off from target in the first place. Not all the time, but some of the time. Right now, you might say making this type of change seems rather daunting, given everything else that we have going on within the organization and otherwise. We're going to talk about that in a second. There are different ways to roll out this type of process. And so, in wrapping up, just kind of thinking about, if you're hearing these things today and kind of wondering, what would it look like to begin considering this for our organization? We've seen different methodologies or rollout approaches be successful here. There's been some organizations that go all in, kind of ripping off the Band-Aid type of approach. We're going to shift to a dynamic planning, rolling approach this year. We're getting rid of the budget process. We're doing it across the entire organization. A heavy lift, but for some organizations that makes sense, because if done otherwise, it might not get the attention. It might not have the momentum required to make this type of change. We've seen some organizations adopt this type of approach in a parallel fashion. So we're going to do a traditional budget this year, but we're going to go ahead and start utilizing the rolling forecast as a complement to that traditional annual budget. We might start getting managers looking at KPI scorecards versus traditional financial statement variance reports, and doing that kind of in parallel with some of the things we're doing today. And then over the course of a year, maybe 18 months, making the full transition to this approach. That works well for organizations that are saying, this makes a lot of sense, but there are some nuances and we have a culture that we need to understand this better before we dive into the deep end. And then lastly, pilot approaches. So maybe we don't roll this out organization-wide right now. but we choose a specific entity or area to pilot this type of approach with. Where this has been successful is often at some of the larger health systems that we've worked with. We've seen here is a pocket and kind of an area that's looking to do something differently. They're all in. They have an appetite for this type of change. They can be our spokesperson for then communicating the benefits of this type of approach to the rest of the organization. They will go to bat for us in this type of approach. And organizations have been successful saying, this year we're rolling out this type of approach to, the West region, and next year we're going to then take the learnings from that and apply it to the rest of the health system. So different ways. Like I said before, if you have questions on anything that we covered today, we got some time here at the end. We'll take some of those questions. But also if you think about questions after this or interested in hearing or learning more, you have my email address here, fstevens@stratadecision.com. So with that, I'm going to leave the last 10 minutes here to just field some questions from the group. Again, I want to say thank you for your time today. Hopefully you got a couple points that were helpful in what we went through, and I'll turn it back for questions now.
Yeah, thank you, Frank, for the fantastic presentation. And we will now begin today's question and answer session. So please submit any questions you have by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your dashboard. And we'll try to get through as many questions as we have time for today. Throughout the presentation, we had several questions already come through, so we'll go ahead and jump in with those now. And the first question that we're looking at here, Frank, for you is, this person's wanting to know, are you suggesting a flex budget concept based on volume and expense management initiatives?
This is a little bit different than that. So yes, recommend that as well. But for organizations who are maybe even interested in taking this one step further, where a flex budget is largely, we produce a budget, we look at variable areas and drive the variable areas on a per unit of service or even charge code driven flex approach. And then throughout the year, as we have actual volumes, we then volume adjust our financial targets. This maybe goes one step further than that. And that, yes, we're looking at all of those KPIs on a per unit service basis. So essentially our KPIs are volume adjusted. But then throughout the year, we're actively reprojecting, layering in initiatives, making adjustments and transfers and changes within the plan and the rolling forecast. And it's done, again, at a little bit more high level, not down to the department account level. So there's many shared concepts between these two. Work with many organizations that are just using more of a flex budget approach or target, and that's a viable option as well.
Got it. Thanks for that clarification, Frank. The next question that we had come through, this person says a big time suck in budgeting is the back and forth between the top of the house and operations. And they're wanting to know, what is the right mix of top down and bottom up?
Yeah. So in a traditional budget approach, I think that that looks a little bit different than in this type of approach. So we find that in traditional budgeting approaches, a big problem, the reason why those processes take 5 to 6 months, and I kind of agree with the individual asking this question, is the back and forth that happens. It is that we send out the budget workbooks, as an example, and then we get back the wish list, and now we have to spend the next month or couple months now saying no to all those things within the wish list. In a traditional approach, what we find you have to do there is that you have to be putting a target down to the department level in front of folks and not making it a wish list. Yes, there might be some discretionary spending where we want to go ahead and capture that from the department manager, but everything that can be top-down driven, let's start there as a target. Let's have them manage and they can make transfers and adjustments between departments or accounts, but they have to net to that target. In this type of approach, it changes a little bit in that we're doing high-level rolling forecasts, so we can be a little bit more directive in the approach. We're not necessarily getting down and submitting or posting budget workbooks to department managers and getting their insights and feedback. And we're changing the conversation for the department manager, lower levels within the organization, or even just between finance and operations to, again, just base targets on prior performance. It might seem subtle or not, I don't know, but the dialogue changes where people will say the budget was wrong. That's why we have a variance. Now you can't say that. When you're using prior performance as a target, it's basically, this is where you were. Have we gotten better or have we gotten worse? If we've gotten worse, what are we going to do to get back on track and correct that? So I don't know that that second part answers the question as much as maybe the first part with the traditional budget process, but keep in mind, again, in this type of rolling forecast approach, it's largely a finance-driven exercise where we're collecting insight from operational and other subject matter experts. So you kind of remove that back and forth altogether.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, that makes sense. Just kind of changing the conversation and sort of getting rid of that back and forth. That makes sense. I feel like we have time for one more question, and then Frank, I'll give you a moment to share any final thoughts, and then we'll wrap things up. But the one other question that we had come through here is this person is just wanting to know how widespread is service line budgeting applied in these approaches?
Yeah, if we look at the organizations that have adopted this type of approach, or even just in traditional budgeting, the percentages or figures are the same. So when we say service line budgeting, I'm assuming that Karen's referring to instances where, we want to look at clinical service lines, model volumes on those clinical service lines to then inform the plan. We see about probably 20 to 30% of health systems taking that type of approach today. It has been on the rise, largely as organizations shift their leadership structures to maybe a more horizontal or service line focus. So often folks say, yeah, we'd love to take a service line planning approach, but we're really not set up that way to do that in the way that we have our leadership defined. Well, we've seen that change. We do and work with a lot of organizations that have taken that approach and are shifting towards that approach. So we're 20 to 30% today. I think if things continue to head at this velocity or the current velocity, probably, we would be saying 40 to 50% in a couple of years.
Thank you so much, Frank. We have a few more minutes left before the top of the hour. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with everyone today before we wrap things up?
No, the last thing I would just say is that at least in the organizations that Strata and I've worked with in taking this approach, one interesting thing to note is that no one's really gone back to a traditional budget process after adopting this. Now, we've had some clients and organizations that we worked with that were later acquired by another health system, and therefore you had to adopt their planning approaches. But other than that, if you ask the organizations that have adopted this thing that kind of seems a little bit daunting, unequivocally or kind of in all cases, we would hear that they would never go back to traditional approaches. So there's merit here, and the last thing I would just say is thanks again for everyone's time. I hope you found a few things that were helpful here, and I appreciate the great questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Frank, for the excellent presentation today. I also want to take a moment to thank Strata Decision Technology for sponsoring today's webinar. And we hope that everyone enjoys the rest of your day, and we look forward to having you join us for future webinars.